my screen here if I can. I want to. Thank you, Rachel. Last time we met, we had several folks that were involved with pastured poultry, and there is actually a great resource for pastured poultry. It's the American Pastured Poultry Producers Association, and if we have just a second here, I can bring up one more quick slide, and I'll share that with everyone. And if they're, let's see, screen share. Oops, okay, I can't share my screen right now because I gave Rachel the control of the car here. So I'll try and do that at the end of the session. The American Pastured Poultry Producers Association actually does something very similar to this, but focused only on pastured poultry. They do theirs the third Tuesday every month year round. And I can send you that connection information if you're interested. We will try and answer some questions in the chat box. We might put links in, but those links are deactivated just so that we can't get involved with any malware or anything. You'll have to kind of copy those down yourselves and then do it that way. Apologize for that inconvenience, but we don't want anybody Zoom bombing us. Apparently that's a thing that we're all learning about this. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rachel so she can introduce Jamie, and we'll get going. You're still, you got to unmute yourself, Rachel.
All right, now we're going. Good evening, everyone. Nice to see a lot of familiar faces and names. My name is Rachel Baressa. I work with Golden Sands as the outreach person there. Tonight we've got Jamie Patton. She's the Senior Outreach Specialist with UW Extension out of the Shawano office, focusing on soil health and cover crops. And I think I've heard she's happiest in a soil pit.
Yes, I am. All right, can I share my screen?
Yeah, you should be able to.
All right. Hopefully you can see that. All right, so as they said, my name is Jamie Patton. I've been given 10 minutes, so anybody who knows me knows that I cannot talk about soils for just 10 minutes. So we're gonna try very quickly just to talk a little bit about soil health and grazing, and just kind of give a general overview before we get into the fun discussion that we'll have afterwards. So I just wanna point out that I'm trained as a podologist mostly, so I get really excited about soil aggregates, and I know we're gonna dive into the wonderful world of soil biology tonight. But if anything over my last 20-year career so far is the more you know, the more you realize you don't know. And that is something about soil health that keeps me excited every day. So I spent my today reading a couple research articles, getting prepped up, because I know Rachel sent me one that she's really excited about, and we'll talk a little bit about tonight. But somebody needs to mute because I'm getting my feet, I can hear myself. So but when we talk about soil health, we're going to make an assumption as we go through about our 10-minute presentation today. So what is the main contributor to soil health? So when you look at Iowa State's publication, Dr. Casey has identified soil organic matter as the main contributor to soil health. And so we're going to focus on that tonight. How can we look at our grazing systems, and how do our grazing systems impact soil organic matter if that is the driving force of soil health? And why did they choose soil organic matter? I know many of you are very, very well versed in soil health, so this is all a review for you. But for those of you who are new, soil organic matter is the key linchpin for soil health and many of our chemical, biological, and physical properties. So you can see that general diagram that almost every soil health presentation will give, talking about how these these properties interface each other. We know our soil organic matter is important in nutrient cycling. Nutrient cycling is impacted not only by organic matter, but soil biological properties, as well as the soil physical properties and that aggregation, how water infiltrates, whether or not we're able to store plant available water in that soil. So we know the energy for that ecosystem function, which is where soil organic matter is the kind of the center, that energy is coming from photosynthesis. And you're going to see, as a soil scientist, it does pain me a little bit, but I'm going to be talking a lot about plants tonight, because that's going to be the key to helping us build soil health, the key to helping us build that soil organic matter and feed those beneficial microbes that are doing wonderful things for our soil. So we know that that energy for that ecosystem function is photosynthesis. It's driving that carbon flow that's improving soil aggregation, water holding capacity, soil stabilization. You can read the slide, right? So I always like to show this slide. So I worked with the NRCS several years ago looking at what we think were our original soil organic matter levels in Wisconsin. So I'm stationed up here in Northeast Wisconsin. So what we did, and I put a little bit of data down there in the bottom left-hand corner, is the NRCS soil scientists went out and they sampled soils of key soil series in each county that were under mature woodlands. So we were making the assumption that they had not been cultivated for a very long period of time, or maybe not at all. And this was going to be our way of representing what we thought our original soil organic matter levels are. So, you know, we had no idea what they were going to be going into it. We knew our agricultural soils were probably running somewhere between 1% and 3% organic matter. And you'll see I blocked them out, because what we found, to me, was quite shocking, particularly in my sandy soils here in Shawano County. You'll notice that what we think our original soil organic matter levels were in this area were somewhere between maybe 5% in our sandier soils, up to 8 to 9% in some of our heavier textured soils. What this tells me is that in the last 100 to 150 years since European settlement, we have really dramatically impacted soil organic matter levels, and therefore the way in which those soils function. So we need this revolution to regrow our soils, to bring that soil organic matter back because of its key function in not only the soil ecosystem, but our overall environment as well. So I'm going to go very quickly. So how do we build that soil organic matter? I'm just going to point out there are two types of soil scientists. There's the lumpers and the splitters. So some of you, when you look at this picture of the soil profile, you see basically two layers, one on top, one on bottom. One's a little brown, one's a little red. You know, and if you're a soil geek like me, I was trying to decide of how many soil horizons I was going to go with. I'm a true splitter. I was looking at maybe five or more. All right. So when we talk about soil organic matter, for those of you who maybe are new or who like to think more broadly, we're going to talk about soil organic matter in a lumping kind of context. And for those of you who really want to get down into the details, we'll talk about it more in a splitting type complex. So from the lumper viewpoint, how do we build soil organic matter? Well, this is the standard information that we get all the time, right? We have that starting organic matter. We're going to add to it. We're going to subtract from it those organic matter losses, and then we end up with our ending soil organic matter. So when we think about the 4 soil health principles, and I use the 4 rather than the 5 because I was rushed to get this done today, right? So when we know livestock are an integral portion of building soil health, and I'm going to put that under maximize diversity. When we look at this lumper viewpoint, how do we add organic matter into the soil? Well, it's growing those perennial forages, it's grazing those covers, right? So when we think about, it's not only, we tend to focus on the residues, so the plant biomass, the above ground and the below ground root biomass, but in all reality, and we're going to talk a lot about these exudates, that leaking of carbon into the rhizosphere and feeding those soil organisms is also a very important part of helping to bring soil organic matter levels up. So having those perennial crops, having a cash crop followed by a cover crop, keeping that living root all year long helps to build organic matter over time. We know diversity, and so plant diversity, input diversity. So this is where I put manure, right? I love manure, and this is where I put up my new picture right here, and that's where I was laughing this morning. I've worked with most of these species in manure because I love manure and what it does for the soil. It increases microbial activity. It brings new organics into the system that helps to build that soil health. So that input diversity as well. Don't forget above ground insect and animal diversity. They're also the livestock that we're working with that are helping to contribute to soil health, as well as that microbial diversity. All of these factors are bringing diverse carbon additions into our soil. They're helping to feed those different components of that microbial community that are overall building soil health. How do we reduce soil losses? Well, or excuse me, soil organic matter losses? Well, we know what that is. Like I said, you've all seen this before. Reduce tillage and increase our crop rotations. So I was doing soil health back in graduate school way back in the 90s. It wasn't called soil health back then, but what we were finding is as we all know, right, the longer the rotation you have, the more grass, the more hay, the less tillage you have in a rotation, the better the soil health is overall. And why is that? Because we start to reduce that loss of carbon as carbon dioxide, right? We don't get that flush of microbial respiration we get with tillage. We're able to store that carbon. We're able to, in the soil, we're able to reduce erosion overall. And so all of this, when we think about a lumper, kind of a big picture, 30,000 foot view, this is how we increase organic matter in our soil. We bring more carbon in, we bring more organic matter in, and we stop carbon from being lost. We're always going to lose carbon, right? We got to feed those microbes. They're always going to be respiring. They're always going to be producing CO2, but we're trying to bring in more and lose less. And we can do that in how we manage our grazing and how we manage our forages. That forage, how we manage our forages is important not only for environmental quality and animal health, but also biomass production. And I'm not sure if anybody listened to Dr. Chris Nichols on a webinar yesterday, but it was a really fun, I never thought of it in this way, but it was a really fun way to think about how grazing can introduce carbon into a system. And that's where this little question I put up there where it says, can disturbance be good? So she talked about how when we look at grazing bovines, so when we think about how cows graze, right, they wrap their tongues around and they tug on that plant material. When they do that, they actually disrupt that root system. They rip off some root hairs, they rip off some fine roots, right? And that causes a leaking of carbon into that system, right? And as that plant tries to put more carbon in, trying to create a scab over that wound where we have kind of injured those root systems, that's an additional carbon flow into the soil. So when we think about even different types of grazing species, we want to reduce disturbance, but in all reality, maybe a little bit of disturbance, right? Pulling that plant up a little bit by that grazing cattle, it maybe is increasing organic matter contents over time. So also thinking, again, I have to present some science to you, right? So you can dive in the literature, you can find it pretty easily. So I just pulled this one from Dr. Teague at Texas A&M. So looking at the use of that rotational multi-paddock grazing, that managed grazing system versus a continuous grazing system, they were looking at can they improve, right, soil properties over time. And again, you'll see right at the top, increased soil organic carbon. What I thought was really fun, if you read through that paper, is Roundtree, who was doing work up in Michigan on cultivated pastures, found that they were able to, and I didn't translate these into English numbers, because English unit numbers, because it's not important. But what they found is that Michigan, in that perennial pasture system, they gain 3 milligrams of carbon, should be megagrams, 3 megagrams of carbon per hectare per year with that grazing system. But what was important, and why the actual number isn't important, is what they compared that to what a zero greenhouse gas of footprint might look like for that rotational grazing system. And all they needed to do was, in a rain-fed system, was sequester about 1 megagram of carbon per hectare per year. So you're sequestering in that managed grazing systems 3 times more carbon than what is needed to basically have a zero greenhouse gas footprint, which I thought was a really fun and fascinating number to think about. So very quickly, I know I'm talking quick because, like I said, we're going to get to the discussion. For those of you who need a little bit more detail, right, the splitter viewpoint. So those of you who are nodding are like, yeah, Jamie, there were 5 or 6, 7 horizons in that soil pit. This is what you want to know, right? It's not just as easy as adding soil organic matter and having the additions being greater than the losses to end up with more organic matter in the end. It's actually about protecting that organic matter. And this is where I love the details, because this is where it gets fun, right? So how do we get carbon to stick in our soil, right? So soil organic matter accumulation is impacted by many things, but it's impacted, and I highlighted two, the physical properties of the soil. So how well can microbes connect with that carbon that's being released in the soil? How can they get to it? Can they decompose it? Can they transform it into a carbon source that's going to be able to be stored in the soil? And how well can our soil actually physically protect organic matter? So when you look at soil organic matter accumulation in the soil, it's not just additions and bringing it in, is we actually have to protect it from further degradation. So we protect that soil organic matter in one of two ways typically. And when I say we, I really mean the soil. So how does the soil protect that organic matter from further degradation? We have to either occlude it, so we have to store it and hide it inside soil aggregates so that it isn't further degraded, or we have to complex it, so we have to put it in with clays, for example, and create these really hard to decompose complexes. So protect that organic matter from further decomposition. So we can't control how much clay is in our soil, but we can impact aggregation in our soil. And so when we think about these managed grazing systems, right, versus a continual grazing system, there may be a reason why they're accumulating more organic matter. We all know that we're doing a better job of protecting aggregation. We're doing a better job at protecting that structure in that soil so that we get not only better root growth and better water and air exchange, but that aggregation is also helping to hide this organic matter and help store it in the soil over the long term. I think this is really fun. Some of you have seen this diagram before. It's really, really complex. But what I want you to do is just focus on the top. You can probably see my pointer here, right? So how do we build what we're interested in are these water-stable aggregates. I just wanted to give you the recipe, right? Science sometimes tries to is a little hard to understand, but in all reality, what we're looking at is all we want to build is these water-stable aggregates down here. And what does it take to build a water-stable aggregate? It takes a root, right? It takes a root that's exuding carbon and sugars, and all sugars are carbon, so it's exuding those carbons into the rhizosphere so that the microbes, the fungal and bacterial populations can act on it and help to produce those glues, right, to start to glue that aggregate together. So it starts with root exudation, it starts with root exudations, which fosters microbial activity. The microbial activity then helps to glue together these aggregates. We have some faunal activity, so larger critters out there helping to create those aggregates, and some of our minerals helping to create these aggregates. But this is key. So if we want to, and this is where it always comes back to the same thing. This is why I get really excited, right? The key to building organic matter, we bring in additions of carbon through plants, the plant roots, and the root exudates. And how do we build aggregates? We build aggregates through roots and root exudates, stimulating that microbial population. Some of you have seen this before because I love to think about how long does this carbon reside in our soil. And when we think about these pastures, they do an awesome job of sequestering that carbon for a long period of time. So what you're looking at is a table showing mean residence time in years of macroaggregates, so the large aggregates, and the microaggregates, the small ones. So how long do these aggregates live, basically, within that soil matrix? And what you'll see is many of our row crop systems, soybeans, right? We're looking at maybe 1 to 7 years. Corn, we're looking at, maybe a few decades. But when we look at our temperate pasture grasses, because there's less disturbance, because we're helping to build those aggregates and those microbial communities in that well-managed system, we're able to store that carbon for centuries. And that's important to us, as that organic matter, again, is providing not only all of these benefits nutritionally for our plants, biologically to our microorganisms, but also environmentally as we think about building these resilient systems that can better withstand climate differentials, right? Climate change, climate intensities, as well as help to reduce our input requirements for many of these systems. So I think that's really fun when you look at that. Pastures, continuous cover, do a great job of helping us store that carbon in the soil. If you want to take it one step further, and Rachel should smile here. So I read this article, right? So she sent me this article. She's like, this is so cool, right? Because it takes this even one step further on how carbon gets stored in the soil and why diverse pasture mixes and why incorporating cover crops into our systems is so important. Is what the researchers found out of Michigan State is that we really need pores that, as you can see, 30 to 150 microns in diameter. Okay, 150 microns is about the thickness of a human hair. So if you want to put that in perspective, we're talking really small pores within the soil. And what is in these pores? It's the microorganisms that are breaking down these carbon substrates and that are helping to incorporate that carbon. And you'll notice it says, the products are important contributors to soil organic matter accumulation, and they move into the adjacent soil matrix where they're blah, 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 physiochemical mechanisms. So that storing inside those aggregates, that storing that's facilitated by those clays, we need these tiny, tiny little pores in order for the microbes to connect with the dissolved carbon, the microbes to connect with those residues that are being incorporated in the soil. They need these tiny little pores. They live there. They're producing enzymes in there. They're breaking down the organic matter in there. And then that allows that carbon, as it's decomposed, to reincorporate itself within the soil matrix, protect itself in the soil matrix so that it accumulates over time. I told you we were going to get into some splitting here, right? We had lumpers and now we're into the splitters. So what is it? What were the recommendations? It says biological factors, differences in root architecture, differences in root densities, diameter, strength, fine biomass, and mycorrhization are known to affect soil porosity. Systems with greater plant diversity have a greater variety of root architectures and therefore will accumulate organic matter better than those systems that don't have that diversity, right? That's a lot of information in less than a few minutes, right? But it doesn't matter who you are. What did I just breeze through very, very, very quickly? It doesn't matter if you look at soil organic matter and soil health in this aspect. As a lumper or the splitter, the story is the same. It's about roots, and more roots, right? And so the roots are bringing the carbon into the system. They're providing exudates, bringing carbon into the system. The roots are creating and helping to create those aggregates that are helping to store carbon in the system. The roots are creating those tiny little pores that are connecting the microbes with that carbon to help sequester it. It's about different roots. It's about roots all the time. It's roots, and more roots. And along with that, you'll notice microbes. Food, water, and shelter for those microbes, because they are a key component of helping to not only stabilize those aggregates, but also break down that organic matter, make it stable, make it persist, and build that soil organic matter over time from maybe where we're at now in some of our fields at that 1 to 3% back up to closer to those original levels that we know existed here in Wisconsin. So hopefully, I was quick. So that is a 50-mile-an-hour, that was a 150-mile-an-hour view of soil organic matter. So I will stop sharing my screen and take a deep breath and a drink of my soda. Yes,
Jamie,
sir.
there is a one question came in as you were going 50 miles an hour. You were talking about clay in the soil, but they say they've got more of a sandy soil. Do all these principles still apply to sandy soils?
Same principles apply, right? Because the only way you're going to, this is why when you look at a sandy soil, it just makes it more difficult to store carbon in that system, right? Because you're not able to produce those organoclay complexes that help to sequester it. And you're all looking at me strangely. What are you talking about? You all have seen this complex. You've all seen organic matter tied up with clays, right? You've dug a hole in the ground and you've seen that dark streaking down through maybe through worm channels, right? And it looks kind of waxy, it looks kind of chocolatey. That's what you're looking at, is that organic matter bound to that clay and being sequestered in the system. We don't get that in sandy soils as much, and therefore it's really important for us in sandier soils to rebuild those aggregates and stabilize those aggregates. And that's where we're going to get that carbon stored. And we do that through that system of roots stimulating microbes, so on or so forth, this whole feedback cycle of building organic matter. We know it can be done, right? That Shano soils, if you've ever worked with a Salona in an Anaway, they're on the coarser textures of a sandy loam. And they're in their quote unquote original state, we estimate still have 5% organic matter.
Mm-hmm.
So it can be done. It's just developing the system to get that carbon to stick, to stay.
Folks, if anybody would like to unmute and ask a question directly, that's fine. Otherwise, you can keep entering them in the chat box. Anyone want to ask a question directly?
There's
Hey,
still
Jamie.
yeah. Hi, Mark.
Great presentation. Hi there. How you doing?
Good. How are you?
Good, good. Great presentation. Thank you. I thought maybe it would be good if you could just talk a little bit, there's differences in the horizonation
Yep.
of our native woodland soils compared to what they look like once we start farming or once earthworms come in and start influencing them. And I think that has a lot of influence on what the organic matter levels are in the mineral horizons too. So could you just touch on that a little bit?
Sure, and that was a great question, Mark. So I always get a little nervous when you see another soil scientist pop in and start asking questions, right? He's going to make me get into the details. So when you look at some of these forest-derived soils, what he's talking about is many of them, when you look at their original horizonation, so you would have had what would have been an O horizon. So on top would have been that leaf litter, that duff layer, what we call as soil scientists, the O layer, which is primarily organic. Underneath that, we would have had an A horizon, which would be that mineral horizon that's dominated by organics, but it's still primarily mineral, sand, silt, and clay. And underneath that, oftentimes, particularly up here in the north, we would get something called an E horizon, where basically the clays and silts have washed out, the nutrients have washed out, and we're left with this bleach white sand. So the horizons look a little bit different. And so when we would sample those soils, actually what's really fun, Mark, is I've been able to get into, I know forests that have never been cultivated, and my A horizons. We always have this idea that A horizon in forest soils, we have this tiny little A horizon because that's what we were taught in the textbooks. But what I found in many of the soils up here in Menominee, Oconto, Marinette counties, if I get into mature woodlands, I still had a good 6 inches of plus of A horizon material, which is really strange for a forest-derived soil. So this is where, and what Mark is asking is did we include probably the duff layer in that soil sampling, or was that true? That's a 6-inch soil sample with the O horizon removed, and we still ended up with about 5% organic matter in that surface soil. So for those of you who aren't soil geeks, that made absolutely no sense. But for those of us who get really geeked out about standing in a soil pit, hopefully it made a little sense. Did that answer your question, Mark?
Yeah, thank you, Jamie. I'm just wondering, in those areas where you saw that well-developed A horizon, did you see the influence of earthworms there? Because I know that's been a big thing in a lot of our soils, and from an agricultural standpoint, we love it. From an ecology standpoint, maybe not so much.
So I was actually working with an archaeologist. So when I have some pictures, I should send them to you. I was working with the archaeologist up in Menominee County. So very minimal earthworm activity in those soils, particularly as we get into the reservation.
Cool, thank you.
I have a question here, Jamie, that actually came in before we started via email, and it was an opinion on applying mycorrhizal fungi when we establish a new perennial pasture. In this case, it's pasture converted from a cornfield last year that was already marginal quality. Would this do any good for us?
And this is where, that's where I was wondering, so this is where I don't have any strong research from Wisconsin to tell you yes or no. So if you dive into the literature, it's going to tell you, and actually I will share my screen here quick just so you can all see what I'm talking about. There is varying results when we look at whether or not these inoculants have an impact on crop productivity. Most of the time when you dive in literature, they're going to tell you no, because and if you talk to soil ecologists, and there may be some on here that may want to chime in and give you a better answer. I was always told, and I chat with them a lot, Jamie, if you build it, they will come. They're already there. You just need to, the populations are just low. You just need to feed them. And you need to provide them habitat. So the mycorrhiza are there. You just have to build a soil health management system to increase their populations. And unfortunately, I can't. Let me share my screen here quick. So UW Extension does have a fact sheet on mycorrhiza. If I can get that, that's not the right one. So I apologize. I'll stop sharing my screen. And what they're going to tell you is that it's going to vary, rather than show you, it's going to vary upon what your initial soil conditions are. They're recommending you try it on a small scale and see that if you see any difference in productivity. If you go back into the literature, they'll also tell you that if you're looking at inoculants, and they're very expensive, if you're going to try one on a small scale to see if you see any difference, find one that has multiple strains of mycorrhiza. So there's not just mycorrhiza, there are many different species of mycorrhiza. So if you're going to try an inoculant on a small scale, find one that has multiple species, because there will be different niches within not only the soil environment, but within your soil that where one species may be better suited than another. So it's kind of a we don't know. Soils are individuals. It may work sometimes, it may not work others. We just don't know.
Would just as you talked or spoken here, it makes me think about when we compost our bedding pack and then apply that, it seems like it stimulates, I mean, it's a shot of microbial
Yep.
like to the soil, isn't it? I mean, is it jump starting soil life if we use compost?
It is, and so you're going to get some of those composting organisms in there, as well as when you think about what a beautiful carbon source you're providing, as well as the tilth of that material is also excellent. So it's providing not only a food, but water holding and habitat support for those organisms. So composts are always a good, I always find them to be good things. Like I said, and when used right time, right place, right source, I really do like manures. We've looked at done some research up here in Northeast Wisconsin. Even with liquid dairy manures, we're seeing a jump in microbial biomass as well as microbial respiration. So not only the total amount of microbes that are there, but how active they are with those organic carbon sources. So compost, manures, when used appropriately, are excellent for helping to rebuild soil microbial populations or stimulate those populations. So I always get a little hesitant on inoculants, just because they're there, and even if you add them, if your soil doesn't provide the right habitat and you spend all that money and add them and you don't provide what they need, they're going to not be productive anyway. So I'd rather build the house and see who comes, rather than throw them in and hope for the best.
Kind of going based off of that. Hi, this is Drew Carlson, and I'm in Ryo, Wisconsin, just north of Madison. We have very sandy soils, and we are going to be converting a field that was 12.7 acres that was previously soybeans and corn rotation for the past, 20 years. And when you're talking about the right time and the right conditions to add in that manure in order to kind of help jumpstart, what would your suggestions be if someone who's starting to transition to pasture mix, and then at what point is kind of the right conditions and the right timing for, like, let's say I was able to get some manure from a nearby dairy or something like that. Can you talk a little bit about that, please?
Sure. And so when we look at Manure Applications, and I know I know a lot of you, so we have a lot of people who can chime in and give you real applied on-farm information for this. But so when I think about this scientifically, right, when I put manure into the soil, I want to put enough that I'm going to have the highest likelihood of plant uptake at that point in time. So a little bit early in the season to get that plant up and growing. But in all reality, when I look at manure, I want it mostly going on to growing plants if I can get it on. Therefore, why? Because then I'm going to have the highest likelihood of that nutrient uptake, and I'm talking mostly nitrogen at this point in time, nitrogen uptake by that growing plant. I'm going to reduce potential environmental issues either through nitrate leaching or potentially phosphorus or ammonium runoff with rainfall events. So ideally in season when we have an actively growing crop, what we oftentimes see is rate is extremely important. I've spent a lot of time working on land spreading of milk. And when you think about and why that has anything to do with manure is when we look at manure and milk, they're high biochemical oxygen demand. What that means is that it takes a lot of oxygen for those microbes to break those materials down over time. And so applying manures, milks, whatever it may be, the rate is really important because I don't want to put too much on, run out of oxygen, create anaerobic conditions in the soil, and really do harm to my microbial communities. So I'm going to want to apply these materials when my soil conditions are drier, so definitely below field capacity, so that I make sure that I have some oxygen movement into that soil, and applying at a rate that I don't overwhelm the system. That is a really terrible, ambiguous answer, and that's what you get from scientists, right? Is it really does depend. I am a spoon feeder, so I like a little bit, multiple times a year, right?
Yeah.
So, and I think we would all agree, is that practical in many times? No. Depending on the growing season, but a little bit more frequently is better than a slug. And I see Kevin sitting here. Kevin, do you agree with me? Darn it when you show your video and I know who you are. So, no?
I won't argue with you, Jamie.
Oh, that Kevin or Kevin Mahalko,
Oh.
he smiled at me too, right? So I got Kevin Shelley, a nutrient management specialist. I got a dairy guy here. So Mark, I got a soil scientist over here with so
I don't mind being mistaken for Kevin Mahalko, that's for sure.
There's others on here. What recommendations do you have for Drew as he's transitioning from a grain system into a continual pasture system, and how does he manage manure and start to bring that soil back to health? I know you all have great answers for him. This is not a Jamie show. This is a discussion.
I've always found sands a little bit more challenging, and we do have a couple grazers in the northern part of the county up along the Wisconsin River that have some really sandy soils, and getting their organic matters up has been a little more difficult than elsewhere because we've got silt loams everywhere else. That's a really easy soil. So we've actually tried to do in the one case, he's an organic grazer, and done a little bit more with some crop rotations and grazing cover crops, just trying to get multiple pulses of roots going down into the soil. We discovered actually a massive hardpan at a foot that he didn't even have a big enough tractor. He had to go hire a neighbor to break through that. And actually, once we relieved that, things really started to get a lot better. But it took a lot of energy to get that. In my opinion, it took a lot of energy to get that sand moving in a good direction. And lots of manure, lots of compost, and then keep doing it.
Continual cover. I cannot emphasize enough continual cover in a sandy soil. So I alluded back to my master's work was actually in Amish and non-Amish soils, soil health on Amish and non-Amish soils throughout the central Midwest. And so everybody believed that, with the incredible biomass removal off of an Amish system along with the moldboard plow, they were going to have completely different or worse soil health than a lot of my reduced till and no-till types English farmers. But we found that wasn't true. And we attributed it back to longer crop rotations and that having that permanent crop in that rotation was key to maintaining soil health in those systems.
I have a question in the chat box that came in about grazing cover crops. Won't that compact the soil if it's on crop ground?
So it can. So that's where, when you look at soils, and that's where it all has to do with moisture content. And so when you look back at the anecdotal information, what's really fun about soils is that as you build soil health, as you build those aggregates, as you build that network of mycorrhizal fungi and roots over time, what happens is the soils become more resilient. They become stronger. The soil strength goes up, and they're able to overcome disturbances such as grazing, as that hoof traffic, such as wheel traffic as well. So that's when I say anecdotal information. When you talk to a lot of guys, cash grain farmers and dairy farmers who were using a soil health management system, they were actually able to get into their fields last year earlier than their neighbors who were not using a soil health management system, because those soils were drier, they were stronger, they didn't have the compaction, they didn't have the rutting that everyone else did. So when you think about building soil health over time, coming in and having those animals graze, it's about making sure that that field, that paddock is ready, right? So it's just like with equipment. If the soil's too wet, we don't want those animals out there. That moisture acts as a lubricant and allows for the easier destruction of those aggregates. So as long as the soils are dry enough, so below field capacity, you have that good root structure out there, that you're not running them hard, right? So same practices idea that you would rotate them through, not that them intensively graze, move the water, move the minerals, move whatever, so that they're not congregating in the same spot over and over again. There are some practices you can use to reduce soil compaction over time. Oftentimes, and when you look at those hooves, depending upon the size of the critter that you have out there, oftentimes that compaction is isolated to the soil surface if it does occur, and it can easily be overcome with biological activity, root growth, freeze thaw, wet dry, so on and so forth.
That's I found that I've gone out with a penetrometer and pushed that in, and where I find compaction, it's in about 2-3 inches, 4 inches maybe. That's about it. It's not very deep, and then usually by spring it's been gone.
Yeah, freeze thaw does a great job on the top 1 to 2 inches.
Let's see, I've got a long question here in the chat box, unless somebody's going to jump in and ask another question with an open mic or unmuting themselves.
Jamie,
Hi, Kevin.
I joined a little late, so maybe you said something about this, but do you have any sense as to either generally or a specific research source about the ability of a well-managed grazing system to assimilate enough carbon to significantly offset the methane emissions from particularly cattle that would be grazing, or
Yeah.
just a general sense about the carbon budget of a pasturing system in itself, and relative to other ways of feeding cattle.
And I showed a little bit, Kevin, a research study that was quoted out of Michigan that showed that a well-managed grazing system actually sequestered 3 times more carbon than was actually being introduced to make them a zero greenhouse gas emission.
Oh, that was the Roundtree study?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and this is not ubiquitous. So if you go into, this is the fun thing, if you go into the literature, so depending upon the soil system, there's also studies that show that with deeper rooting systems, as we introduce oxygen into some of these subsurface layers, that we may actually lose a lot of carbon by oxygenating lower subsoil horizons that would have not had oxygen in the past, and therefore release more carbon than they would have under a non-managed soil health managed system. So when we start to make these generalities, I get very, very nervous because each soil is very, very different, as we know, from Jean's beautiful silt loams to the sands up here in the central sands to, the heavy clays over near the lakes. So soils are individuals. They don't always act the way we think they should. They're like the children standing at my door, knocking, wanting to come in right now. So they just don't listen and do what they're told. I'm kidding. Smile.
Hey, can
Come
I have
on.
a question?
Here's a
If I
phone
could-
question. Go ahead.
Can I make a comment
Oh.
about a lot of grazers I've worked with? You know, especially like in the coulee region where we do have some sand too. The ones that are very intensive, you know, very diverse, you know, really focusing on the root system, and we have a couple that are really working with compost quite a lot. So, you know, they're bringing in, you know, some outside off the farm manure sources too, any type of carbon they can get in their soil. So, you know, they're just looking at building it, especially through the roots and grazing. But if you want to accelerate it, if you can somehow bring other hay or some other manure onto the farm, it helps.
I have a question. I was wondering if you could comment on the University of Minnesota study that was actually presented in their Sunday paper a while back, which suggested that it's going to take like hundreds of years to have the soils recover from cropping.
That's interesting. I can't quote. I didn't read that article. I didn't see that that research study. So it depends upon what you call recover, right? So are our soils going to return back to what they look like prior to European settlement? No, they're not going to. Might they look better? Maybe. Might they look worse? Maybe. So when we think about soil, you know, and this is a really hard one to answer. So the soils that we see on the landscape before European settlement had actually formed in this area over 10,000 years under various climates, right? We were covered by a glacier. We went through boreal forests. We went through deciduous forests, right? So they were showing, and that's where Mark was kind of asking me earlier, they were showing the signs of formation under various climates as well as various vegetation schemes. Our climate's not the same as when these soils formed. Our vegetation doesn't look the same, and I wouldn't expect our soils to look the same, even if we brought them around. Then, when we first opened up that virgin land, it's not the same situation. I wouldn't expect them to look the same. Microbial populations are going to look different. Horizonation is going to look different. Organic matter accumulations are going to look different.
They also didn't graze it.
No, and that's where I like grazing. So, and that's where you can't see it. This degree right here is from Oklahoma. So I spent a lot of time talking about native rangelands, right? And the importance of grazing to spatial heterogeneity. So maintaining, you know, a diverse plant species within a range situation, and how that impacts not only wildlife, but environmental equality. So it is, and that's where when we look at a natural system, that incorporation of manure, that incorporation of disturbance, as I talked about how, you know, different grazing types will impact not only the rooting structures and the release of carbon, but when you think about how time of year, what they graze, how they graze, and it all comes back into play when we talk about soil formation. So.
We had a question in the chat box with, does carbon sequestration differ in management intensive grazing and adapted multi-paddock grazing systems?
That's a really good question, Michael. Somebody else, I don't know that I've read the difference. Like I said, does anybody have a better answer? Then I don't know. The one I'm going to use right now, that I don't have that answer, and I'm going to have to get back to you. Joanna, do you have an idea? She's muted. There you go.
Yeah. Jamie, yeah, same. I don't have any study at hand, but you know, through different grazing methods in general, I usually like to use the example of how preserving those native grasses for a long time, right? Before the settlement. I mean, we're talking native under bison grazing as opposed to cropping later on. But when you look, when you make a comparison over time, you can see that where does the corn belt stands today? You know, if we look through the region, basically where we had all those native grasses. Mm-hmm. So extrapolating that into the grazing system or the grazing methods, when we do, let's say, intensive management grazing, or whatever, as I call them, whatever type of rotational stocking, you know, first, last, backstop, what you're trying to do is to preserve the growth of the plant there. And then the long-term effect would be the same as when we look back, you know, trying to accumulate as much organic matter as we can through preserving the growth of the plant.
Yeah, my looking or reading Michael's question, you know, AMP grazing, high density grazing, when these folks are advocating for these ultra high stock densities, my understanding is they're only defoliating about 30%, maybe 40% of the plant. So if they are actually doing that, not really grazing it down, more trampling it, if that plant is still intact, wouldn't it continue to feed soil roots, feed soil biology, versus grazing it down 50, maybe 60%, and all those roots coming to a stop, having to generate new roots, stop feeding soil biology? I'm not saying it works, I'm just saying I'm wondering if that might be the mechanism that this is occurring.
Yeah, and it's going to vary by species and environment, and when I say species, plant species and all of that. But yeah, it's there. I have no answer.
Yeah, no, I think it's, it goes back to the same, trying to favor the plant in a way that, you graze the above ground where you're not impacting too much of the root. Some people call it the management intensive grazing, and that's putting a bunch of animals and bringing it down to certain stubble height. I think the key here is always preserving the high stubble height. That's going to vary by species. Mm-hmm. So you have things like orchard grass. Well, probably you need to leave over a foot of residual stubble. You're grazing Kentucky bluegrass, you can come down a little bit lower because you have those that rely on the rhizomes underground stems, so they can take more of the grazing. But in every case, what we want to favor is the regrowth of the plant for accumulation of biomass, accumulation of root. Basically, what we're looking for, we have a factory, which is our grass. And we have that factory that is making a lot of biomass has a lot of warehouse. The warehouse of the grass is going to be the lower portion of the canopy where it's storing a lot of carbon and reserves, and the root portion. And of course, it's going to be variable depending on what species are on the mix. Mm-hmm. We always need to be favoring the most critical of the plant, of the species in the mix. So if we got things that are of taller height, then we need to be more conservative on the residual height or stubble that we leave when we're grazing. So we can keep banking on the reserves, bottom part of the canopy, and the root system. The more root system like we have in the excellent presentation you made, Jamie, is gonna give us all that pore space, tunneling, conditions on the soil that would benefit, the whole system.
We're running kind of low on time. We got a couple questions more in the chat box. Someone wanted to know how long after applying compost or manure to the pasture can you graze it? Someone got a quick answer on that one?
One of the reasons I like composted manure is I don't see refusal afterwards. It doesn't smell like poop anymore. If we applied just manure out of the barn without composting, I see a lot of refusal with cows and sheep. Now, maybe dairy cows are less picky, but I doubt it. So that's another advantage I see for composting. Usually I like to let it get a rain or two on it just to kind of wash it off the grass, or we'll put it on after a grazing, or maybe after a hay harvest is where I really like it.
All right. Another question was, would it be beneficial for the soils to not graze a new seeding during the first year to give time for root development? This I get a lot.
Well, I'm sure we'll get a lot of opinions on that one.
Yeah, I was gonna say that one has no right answer, right?
Could I give an opinion on that?
Go ahead.
What I'd like to
go
see
for
is,
it, Kev. I knew you were going to pop in here.
I typically like to put a cover crop of oats out there, and try to get that off either by machine harvest or grazing when it gets dry. The simplest test is just to pull the plant up, take a sample. How easy is it to pull it up out of the roots out of the ground? If it's too loose, just avoid grazing it right away. But I think it actually stimulates the establishment of that new paddock and pasture to graze it. Probably if you're planting in May, early May, by mid-July, definitely get out and get on it when the conditions are right.
Yeah, I guess I would go ahead, Joanna.
No, I was going to say I totally agree with Kevin. On new planting, once you sense that you have establishment, usually about 60 days later, go with a flash grazing, because that takes the tip and it stimulates the growth later on. I like to go with a light grazing, about 60 days after planting.
I have a quick follow-on question for that, which is I established a pasture last year and kind of hit a window where the seeds did not get washed out of the soil. Sorry about the squeaking, I have a new puppy. And now this year it's, coming back beautifully, but the farmer I'm working with is very concerned about bloat on that new growth. And, kind of what is the trade-off to go ahead and hay a first cut and then bring the animals in June? Terms of
what species did you plant it?
I've got Ladino clover, white clover, orchard grass, fescue, and I think Timothy.
So you got a mix there.
So I'm wondering, I am wondering whether that concern about bloat, just bringing animals in May, is a real concern. But he took one look at it and was like, I'd be nervous about putting cattle on something too rich.
If you're suspecting bloating, something that we have done when we're in situations like that is feed hay before they go in. So that gives you kind of like a little bit of insurance that they're not gonna be bloating. If that's a possibility.
I agree totally with Joanna on that. If you're going out there in like you're talking mid-May, it's going to be pretty immature clover typically. So like with our cows, when we're starting out, we're transitioning onto that pasture and transitioning our whole feeding program from winter stored feed onto that grazing. So we want to definitely give the livestock enough time to adapt to rumen microbes. Oh, sorry. So that you don't have a shock to the system, and you know that's typically when you get blowout is when you get a shock. And you know, looking at things like how wet is it? Is there heavy dew? All of those factors taken into account.
Thanks for that.
I have one quick question. As far as the root composition, does anyone ever take into consideration different diversity of root structure when making pasture mixes? No, not equity.
We're getting a little bit of feedback from an open mic somewhere. Could you repeat the question, Rachel? Hang on, let me see if I can mute everybody, and then you can ask your question. Okay, if you unmute yourself, Rachel, then ask your question. I think I've got the feedback taken care of.
Sounds good. I was just wondering, when making pasture mixes or cover crop recommendations, if the difference in rooting structures is taken into consideration when making mixes, if anyone ever does that, or like that root ranking idea.
Absolutely.
Yep. On if I put a diverse cover crop mixture, yeah, I want broadleaves, I want legumes, I want grasses, just because they're trying to get into different areas of the soil profile. I'd like to see more documentation of its benefits, but it makes some intuitive sense.
But I'm thinking more like what the root action does, like fast rooting, deep rooting fast versus ones that, fibrous root systems. But like, I don't know, we've been looking at a lot of different root action through mason jars this spring. And so seeing the difference between the different plants. So if you're looking for a fast, deep rooted plant and kind of picking plants based on their roots versus their above ground behavior.
Rachel, when you make the mixes, probably I would say, you're looking into legumes, which have a tap root. That's going to be always tunneling deeper, way deeper, in various degrees. So you would have things like red, white, sweet clover. When you put them all together, probably out of all of them, sweet clover is going to be the one with the deeper root seedlings. And you can make the experiment of putting all of them together, red, white, the different clovers, and you'll see that sweet clover will have a deeper tap root. Your grasses, on the other hand, they're going to be fibrous horizontal, not going too deep, about 40, that would be about maybe 2 feet at the most, but it's going to be fibrous. And so that will give you a combination of things. Probably more important is that is important, of course, but it's, what goes with that. And that has to do more with the tolerance of moisture in the soil, combination of pH and combination of pH and moisture. And temperature. So if you got a cool season, some of them would be more cold tolerant, less cold tolerant.
So I see we've gotten a little bit past 8:30. I do actually have 2 polls this evening before everybody jumps off really quickly here. The first is a 4-question demographic poll, so that, being part of the university, we get the pleasure of counting lots of things and reporting it to other people. So I would appreciate your help with that. If you choose not to answer, just say you prefer not to respond. And then the second one is about the future of whether or not we continue this. So I'm going to launch the first poll. We'll give this about a minute. If you could respond as you see fit. And then after a minute, I'll close this, and then we'll open the second poll, which is just a simple question of whether or not you'd like this to continue, because doing pasture walks this spring might be a little bit difficult. And if there's interest, we'd certainly keep doing this occasionally over at least the spring months and maybe into the summer if there's interest. So let's see, we're 30 seconds in. We've got half of everyone providing their demographics. Thank you very much. I appreciate that help. Let's see. Yeah. Okay, well, we've stopped at 36, so 37, 38, and let's see. That's a minute. So I'm going to exit that poll so we don't take up much more time. And then it's going to close that. And then let me see if I can run the second poll. And ask a grazer. Pretty simple question here. And no is a fine answer. It's just we don't, if nobody wants to participate, we can go out in our pastures ourselves, right, Rachel?
Right. Yeah, and we've kind of looked into options as getting Wi-Fi mobile hotspots to do actual pasture walks out in the field too. So we might have much nicer backdrops than just office walls. So Regine, I don't know if we can get where you are.
In my mind, you know.
Gene's doing some mountainside grazing.
Yeah. Okay, let's see. We're up to, of course, the folks on the phone can't vote. I'm sorry about that. There's only some limits to what our technology will deliver for us. So that's a minute on that one. I'm going to close that. And we'll save that and be able to take a look at it. It looks like folks would like to continue this format for a while, Rachel. So we'll have a conversation tomorrow or the next day and see where we go next. But absolutely appreciate everyone tuning in tonight. If you've got questions or maybe some topics that you think might be interested, if you like the format tonight, when we did this 2 weeks ago, if you joined us then, it was just kind of an open discussion on just general grazing without a topic. We thought maybe inviting Jamie tonight to talk about soil health and get us thinking about how we can make some really significant improvements in soil. You know, if we grow more grass, we have more cattle, we make more money, right? That's a good thing. And we have cleaner water. I mean, it's win-win-win. So comments, suggestions are always appreciated. Let me see if I can pull up, let me go to, I can share Rachel's contact information and my contact information here in just a second here. If I go here, let's see if this will work. Ask a grazer. Contact information for myself, gene.schrieffer@wisc.edu and Rachel Baressa at goldensandsrcnd.org. Joanna, I didn't list you, but if you'd like to be available, let me know and I can make sure everyone knows your email also. Or if you want to put it in the chat box, that's fine.
All right, thank you again. Thank you to Jamie, and thanks for everyone for tuning in tonight.
Thanks, Jamie.
Thanks, Kevin.
And I think, Rachel, you're going to have to hit the record button. I think it's going to wind up sharing on your computer or storing on your computer. And if you wouldn't mind sending me the results, I don't know if it's going to